another episode of CogTalk. And a couple of sentences I always say about the university and why we have been doing it. University of Hyderabad is a top research university of India, consistently ranked very well. And we enjoy quite a bit of freedom in terms of selection of intellectual engagements that we think of doing for internationalizing and exchanges. So CogTalk began as a platform where we were primarily interested in bringing luminaries and leaders, thought leaders in mind-brain sciences. And then we have been successful in inviting many important speakers here. And we have discussed many topics starting from philosophical issues to language to decision-making to attention and so on and so forth. So in that sequence, we are very fortunate to have Bernardo Kastrup today with us. And if you Google his name, you will find many books and videos and many long interactions with many other luminaries that he has had. So his presence is very indicative of the manner in which his ideas are being discussed and taken. Briefly talking about his background, I think Bernardo holds 2 PhD degrees, one in computer science, one in physics, and has worked at CERN, and then later on in other corporations like the Philips Research. And now probably Bernardo is mostly into his own philosophical jungle and where he writes, speaks, and debates. But as far as I have understood, his approach is to defend a thesis which is not traditional. He rejects physicalism, materialism of the popular side that we all know very well, and defends a kind of idealism which is metaphysical, but Bernardo believes that there is, and he has his own empirical data and other kinds of things to back that. Probably somewhere he will go today. And I found in reading a couple of papers that his arguments are pretty wide-ranging in nature. They're not the typical, academic arguments, either this way, that way type. So he does not reject empiricism, but he certainly does not see that's the final frontier. As we know, the orthodoxy has become, and it perpetuates all the way down to what even master degree students think about this, the nature of mind or the brain. So we are happy. He has written many books. I'm not reading all the names. He has even given the talk I saw on near-death experience. So it's very wide-ranging in terms of his intellectual capabilities and interests. So we are very happy to really have his time for this program. And this program is recorded and is put later in an edited format on the YouTube channel of University of Hyderabad. So many people will later on they have a look if they could not attend now because of time constraints and etc. So the pattern is that now Bernardo would give his lecture or a talk or a discussion or main points for some time. Then I will ask certain other questions based either on this or in general, and then it is open to the audience. So I request the audience to stay around and have their questions either through the text box or showing up. It is okay. So without further ado, I would request and thank Bernardo again for having accepted the invitation, and he can deliver his talk now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ramesh. So I will tackle only a very small part of what usually is almost 10 hours of content, which of course is impossible to present in one go. So I will focus on what I consider to be recent evidence from neuroimaging, neuroscience, the neuroscience of consciousness, that seems to refute some very fundamental physicalist premises and seems to indicate that a form of idealism would accommodate the evidence a lot more coherently than physicalism. Now, This is only part of a much broader argument against physicalism, which is both logical and empirical, which includes foundations of physics and all kinds of things on the empirical side, and includes a lot of arguments from analytic philosophy on the logical side. So this is only a small part, but it's the part that should be more aligned with your subject area. And since I will speak only for half an hour, consider this a teaser. On the website of Essentia Foundation, essentiafoundation.org, there are, I think, over 6 hours of material covering more. So if you're interested in that, you can always go there. There is no paywall, no registration wall. It's all straight out free for anybody to look. So what I will be focusing on now, and I'll be showing slides in a minute, is a fairly consistent pattern of experimental results that shows that under certain circumstances, not all circumstances, of course, but under certain circumstances, there is a consistent correlation between reduction of brain activity, so less brain metabolism, and an increase in the richness and or intensity of subjective experience. We are used to seeing the opposite. We are used to seeing that if you have richer, more intense experience, there's more brain activation, because as we have tended to think over the past 200 or 300 years, brain activation is subjective experience. So of course they have to go hand in hand, and a lot of the times they do. Today we are in a position that we can train a neural network on the patterns of brain activity measured from people who are watching certain video clips. So the neural network finds the correlations between the images on the video clips and the associated patterns of brain activity. And we can use that neural network later to read the dreams of people. And we are able to accurately say, you've dreamed of watching at a statue. I mean, a very boring experience. And yet there is enough cortical activation that we can say with a fairly high degree of confidence that the person was dreaming of staring at a statue or clenching one's hand. There are papers showing this. But under less ordinary circumstances, the opposite happens. Your brain effectively goes to sleep and you have the richest, most intense experiences of your life. So this is what I want to discuss with you now, and I will show you some slides now. And I'll go straight for the subject. So no introduction slide, nothing. Let's get straight to it. For the longest time, we've always assumed that psychedelic drugs, which induce a trance of unfathomably rich and intense experiences, studies from Johns Hopkins University have shown that a psychedelic experience is consistently ranked in the top 5 or perhaps even top 3 most important, intense, rich, significant experiences in someone's life. It's comparable to the death of a parent, the birth of a child. So it's ranking right on the top 3, 5 most intense experiences. We always assumed that the way psychedelics did this, caused this phenomenology, was by lighting up the brain like a Christmas tree. And this was not only an assumption until 2012, people knew that that was the case, right? We knew that. There's no doubt about it. It can only be that. You cannot have a mind-blowing psychedelic trance without brain activation. So of course, psychedelics will light up your brain like a Christmas tree. That's what they do. And then very early in 2012, the first paper of a new generation of brain imaging studies has come out, or came out. A paper by the Imperial College, which together with Johns Hopkins and the University of Zurich in Switzerland, have been leading research, neuroimaging research on psychedelics. And in that paper, they have studied cerebral blood flow, which is a proxy of brain activity, for psilocybin versus placebo pairs. Psilocybin is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, magic truffles. Some would argue that it was the key ingredient in soma, but that's so open for discussion. Nobody really knows with any degree of confidence what soma was, but there is speculation in that direction. And what you see here in blue is that cerebral blood flow only reduced as an effect of psilocybin drug intake. And this was a very temporally precise experiment. fMRI was used, and fMRI has very, very good spatial resolution, but very poor temporal resolution, as you know. But to address that, because people are just lying on a brain scanner, they were given a little electronics pad where they could, through multiple choice menus, just rank the experience they were having at that specific moment. So things were time-stamped. So they knew that the correlation between cerebral blood flow and psilocybin, or the intensity of the experience, was reversed. In other words, you could predict the richness or intensity of the subjective experience by looking at how much decreased cerebral blood flow or brain activity was. The less brain activity, the intenser the experience reported by the subject. So what you see here in blue is just the delta between psilocybin versus placebo baseline. So there is no increase in brain activity anywhere in the brain. And that's an important point, because the usual argument is that, well, you know, there are activations and deactivations. There is neuronal activation and neuronal inhibition. So some brain activity is inhibitory in nature. So if you sort of inhibit the inhibitors, of course, you have higher intensity of experience. But in that case, you would have to see an increase in experience somewhere in the brain. Even if overall the average could be reduced, you could say, well, most of this is accounted for reducing inhibitory processes. But here we are not looking at only an average, we are looking at a spatially precise measurement of cerebral blood flow, and it only decreases, it doesn't increase anywhere in the brain. And this was confirmed verbally in these many words by Professor David Nutt, who was the leader of this study. Brain activity does not increase anywhere in the brain. So the argument around, you know, inhibiting the inhibitors sort of doesn't hold much water in this case, because if you take away the inhibitors, you would expect that something would be disinhibited somewhere in the brain, and you would see that as a red splotch somewhere on this chart, but it's just not there. Now, this was for psilocybin, and they continued the study. If I manage to go a step further, I wanted to show another slide, but I think I forgot to put it in here. Yeah, I'll stay on this slide. This study was repeated for other substances as well. It was repeated for ayahuasca, which is a South American psychedelic brew based on DMT, dimethyltryptamine. It was repeated, all the classical LSD, all the classical psychedelic drugs were studied, and the results were exactly the same. There was a more recent paper from 2016, I believe. Instead of fMRI, they used MEG, which has very good temporal resolution, not so much spatial, but temporal resolution. And again, the results were the same. They even looked at the spectrum, the total spectrum across all the frequency ranges, alpha, gamma, beta, and so forth. And the power spectrum was significantly reduced across all drugs that were tested. So of all the results that have come out from this renaissance of psychedelic neuroimaging studies, the most robust conclusion by far is that psychedelics drastically reduce brain activity. Your brain effectively goes to sleep while you're having the most mind-boggling experience of your life, the richest, most intense experience of your life, or one of the richest and most intense. So now you would ask, okay, how do the physicalists try to account for this. I mean, when this study here that I'm showing here, when this one came out early in 2012, Christoph Koch, one of the most prominent neuroscientists today, and by the way, I'm going to have a debate with him in November. I forgot this exact date, but I would invite everybody to attend that because it will be a public debate online in COVID times. We will probably discuss this. Christoph Koch published an article on Scientific American expressing his surprise at this result. So if people tell you, well, this is not expected at all, nonsense, they're lying. This was highly unexpected. We knew things were different and turned out we didn't know at all. So how do the physicalists now account for this? It's been now 9 years, almost 10. What story has emerged to try to reconcile this scientifically with the metaphysical physicalist postulate? Keep in mind, physicalism is a metaphysics. It's a statement about reality is, as opposed to how it behaves. Science only deals with how reality behaves. It is completely agnostic of what reality is in essence. That's not science, that's not physics. It is metaphysics, that which lies behind physics, that which lies behind behavior. In other words, what things actually are. What are the things that behave? And physicalism makes statements about that, and as such, it's a metaphysics, just a very, very popular metaphysics in science. So popular that people mix it up with science. So how do the physicalists try to make sense of this? Now, there are a number of different hypotheses, but the one that has commanded consensus, there is only one that has commanded a large degree of consensus amongst physicalists thus far, and that's the notion of the entropic brain, as they call it. They like to use, sorry, I'm being a little subjective in my assessment here, but I can't help. They like to use these pompous words, complexity, diversity, entropy. But in fact, what they are talking about is just noise, brain activity that doesn't fit any discernible pattern. So random brain activity, random firings and inhibitions. That's what they mean by complexity, diversity, entropy, all these pompous sounding words. And what this hypothesis says is that we can account for the phenomenality, the subjective part of the psychedelic experience in terms of increased noise levels in the brain, or increases in complexity or diversity, whatever word you choose. I would use the word noise because that's what it is. So tiny increases of noise in the brain are supposed to account for the mind-boggling phenomenality of the psychedelic experience. That's the hypothesis. And this was one of the main papers published. Of that main paper, this is the main figure that you can see here. And what you see here are charts for different drugs. So here you have psilocybin or magic mushrooms. Here you have ketamine, which is basically a narcotic, but it has a psychedelic effect. And here you have LSD. And then you can see here in this measure of complexity or noise, you can see the difference between placebo in black and post-drug in white. So each pair of points here is a placebo drug pair. That's what you're looking at here for each chart. So what you see is that the drug scores a tiny little bit higher than placebo in this measure of complexity. You see it consistently across all drug pairs illustrated in this figure. And therefore they claim, okay, we account in physicalist terms for the psychedelic experience in terms of a slight elevation of noise in measured brain activity. Now, if you look at the numbers, you see that the average elevation in noise is 0.005 in a scale of 0 to 100. Now, this is not tiny, this is microscopic. This is nearly negligible. But it is statistically significant because they used a lot of placebo drug pairs. And, statistics 101, the more data you have, the easier it is to get to a point of statistical significance. Now, a lot can be said about the relevance or reliability of measures of statistical significance, because it's an arbitrary measure. Somebody decades ago decided that a certain value of P, if you cross that value, it's significant. And if you don't cross it, it's insignificant. There are academic journals today that now have abandoned the notion of statistical significance altogether, because it is so arbitrary, because there are so many cases of p-value engineering, as people say it. If you find enough arguments to discard a certain chunk of your data as unreliable, you can engineer your p-values such as to cross the threshold of statistical significance. There have been scandals about this. In the psychological sciences, it is estimated that 60% of the published results are not replicatable because of this arbitrariness behind the notion of statistical significance. Some journals have abandoned it altogether. You cannot argue your case anymore based on p-values. You have to just expose your data and let the readers figure out by themselves whether they think that's significant or not, as opposed to putting a p-value there that says, oh, it's statistical significance. So a lot can be said about this, but I will not. I will grant that this is statistically significant, okay? And I will even grant that it's relevant that it is statistically significant. You still have a huge problem here, because statistical significance only shows that the effect exists. It doesn't say anything about the size of the effect. You can have a tiny ant effect that is statistically significant, so it exists, but it's still tiny. It doesn't stop being tiny because it is significant. And this effect here is beyond tiny. It is it is microscopic. It's amazing that it's not within the margin of error. So tiny it is. Moreover, in many of the pairs, and you don't see these pairs in this figure, of course, those other pairs are buried in the statistics. But for some of the pairs, brain noise decreased for the psychedelic part of the pair compared to placebo. In other words, there were people who had less brain noise and still had the psychedelic experience. So how do you account for their psychedelic experience then? If psychedelic experience is generated or caused or is increased brain noise, then how did those people have a psychedelic experience? Now, and it doesn't stop there. We know that for most other cases, experience correlates with patterns of brain activation, measured brain activation in the cortex. We know that, for instance, from this paper, neurodecoding of visual imagery during sleep, they did exactly what I mentioned before. They trained a neural network on people watching certain images on a television and measuring their brain activity. They trained the neural network this way, and then they had these people sleep with an EEG cap. So they could measure their brain activity during dream states. And they could predict what these people were dreaming, including one person who dreamed of flying around and then landing in front of a statue and then just looking at the statue. And the researchers pinned it down. They predicted that a dream experience from patterns of brain activation. There are other papers. There was another paper even longer back, I think 2010 or 2011. People lucid dreamed of doing a fist, squeezing their hands like this. And there were very clearly measurable, small but clearly measurable patterns of brain activation associated with that dream experience. Those people were not actually clenching their hands. They were dreaming of doing so. And all the rest of the literature that associates experience with patterns of brain activation, patterns of increased metabolism, because you see, a dead person doesn't metabolize and presumably doesn't have any experience. So you have, in the physicalist premises, you have to couple experience with something that activates in the brain. And most of the literature shows that there is this correlation indeed. So if for psychedelics, the basis, the metaphysical basis of experience is noise, then we have to have a completely different basis for experience in many other cases, like dreaming or ordinary daily experiences in the waking state. So it is not a plausible hypothesis in that it postulates a completely different basis for experience that contradicts everything else in the literature. Now, there are even more arguments against this, but I think it's sufficient what I shared with you. This is what is being tried now. This thing here, this idea that tiny increases in noise levels account for the psychedelic experience. This is the best physicalist hypothesis put forward as of now, according to physicalists themselves, since this brain entropy hypothesis has gathered so much consensus amongst physicalist neuroscientists. So this is what it is. The media has drastically misportrayed this whole thing, including a result from 2016 in which researchers reported, again, drastic reductions in brain activity coupled with psychedelics, but increases in the correlations between, or functional coupling between different brain areas. So that's what has increased, functional coupling between brain areas, neurons that fire together. Activity level has reduced significantly, but amongst the activity that remained, there was more coupling between different brain areas. And one of the pictures in the paper had a lot of red because it was an illustration of functional coupling, not brain activity. What the media did was to take that one picture, remove the legend, the explanation of what you were seeing in that picture, and then saying psychedelics light up your brain like a Christmas tree. Just look at this picture. CNN did this, all the major media outlets did this. Back then I was outraged. I contacted the researchers and said, you guys have to clarify this. You have to do something about this. But they didn't. They stayed in complete and absolute silence, researchers from Imperial College. They did not bother to correct that gross misportrayal, which basically portrayed the result as being the opposite of what it actually was. So this is what you're dealing with. You have to read the papers. You have to look at the scales. Look at the scales here in these graphs. You have to read this stuff carefully and understand what you are seeing in order to see what's been going on in the neuroscience of consciousness today. But it's not only psychedelics. This pattern that associates reductions of brain activity and enrichment or intensification of experience, drastic enrichments, you see it back in all kinds of different circumstances. This was a study published in Neuron in 2010. It was a prospective study done by Italian neuroscientists. They studied people that were going to undergo brain surgery for the removal of tumors. And they scored these people on a scale that they called a scale of self-transcendence. Self-transcendence was basically a psychological scale that tried to evaluate how much you identified your I, yourself, with a very localized body or with something broader. The notion that yourself transcends your body. It goes into the world. It goes across people. That's the notion of self-transcendence. And there was a scale that could be measured based on a number of carefully drafted questions to see how much self-transcendence people experienced before surgery and then after surgery. It's a prospective study, and that's what makes it so powerful. And the result was after surgery, which always causes some degree of collateral damage in brain areas, healthy brain tissue surrounding the original tumor, self-transcendence increased after surgery. Quite significant. So this is lesion patients here in red, and in white you see intact patients. And self-transcendence always increases, and that's especially so when damage or a lesion happens in these areas of the brain. They identified the brain areas which were more prone to being correlated with self-transcendence if damage occurred there. So here you have another instance in which it's not as much brain activity as measured with an fMRI, but brain function impairment, brain damage, which in a sense is more or less equivalent to reductions in brain activity, because those damaged areas would not have the ordinary brain activity that they would otherwise have. So it's another instance in which impairment of brain function correlates with a sort of a particular enrichment of experience, because more self-transcendence is obviously enriching. You identify with more than just your ego or your body. And we can go further. This was another brain imaging study done in Brazil in 2013, if I remember, 2012. It was published, was it in PLOS One? And they studied self-identified trance mediums, people who claim that they could go into a trance and receive information for which there is no ordinary explanation as far as the source is concerned. Tap into knowledge that they couldn't otherwise have. That's the idea of trance mediums. And they divided these people, they divided these people into two groups, which they called the less experienced trance mediums and the more experienced trance mediums, or LEX and EXP. Now, they don't say this in the paper because they're too polite to do that. But what's happening here is that the so-called less experienced trance mediums, or LEX in blue, are not trance mediums at all. These are just people who claim that they can go into trance. And the experienced trance mediums are the people that the researchers, based on all kinds of other data, thought there is something to their claims. They are tapping into something here. We can't outright discard them. So the way for you to see this is control. And this is the actual group being studied. And they are being compared to controls. And why then all this, care with words? For you to have a relevant control group, you have to have in the control group people who actually think they are trance mediums. Otherwise, you don't have a proper control group. That's the idea. And then for some key areas in the brain associated with language processing, logic, reasoning, creativity, and so forth, they looked at how brain activity changed between an ordinary state and a trance state. And for the experienced mediums, brain activity always goes down for all these different areas of the brain, as you see here. And for the control group, it goes up for all these different brain areas. That's what you're seeing in this plot. Now, to make it even more interesting, when they were in the trance state, or when they claimed they were in the trance state, in the case of LEX, they were asked to write text with information that they claimed to have been acquired during the trance. So write down what you sort of cognize, this transcendent information you claim you cognize during the trance. That's what they were asked to do. So they wrote text. It's called psychography. They wrote this text while they were entranced, or at least claimed to be entranced. And today, there is software today that can score text on a degree, on a level, for its level of complexity. You can have very complex text, long statements with all kinds of subclauses in them, and a complex logical argument mapped onto text, or simple text, very short phrases, direct statements, very little complication, very few subclauses. Software can do that in a very objective way today. And it goes without saying that writing complex text ordinarily engages your brain a lot more. It demands higher, or it's correlated with higher brain activity in brain regions associated with reasoning and language processing and so forth. So you would expect that more complex text was correlated with increased activity in all these key brain regions that are associated with writing complex stuff. But for the experienced mediums, as you see here, it's precisely those brain areas that went down, and they wrote more complex text while entranced than while in placebo, so to say, while not entranced. For the less experienced mediums, during the trance, their text became less complex. And, you know, if people are pretending to be in a trance, their brain is engaged with all kinds of other things beyond just writing the text. So it's reasonable to assume that brain regions that are engaged in writing the text and whatever else they are doing to simulate trance state goes up. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. For the control group, brain activity increases when they were writing less complex text. But for the experienced mediums, brain activity decreased while they were writing more complex text. So again, a correlation between decreased brain activity or impaired brain functionality, brain function, correlated with an increase in cognitive ability, cognitive stuff going on. And I could go on and on. There is a number of ways to cause hypoxia, to reduce oxygenation of brain tissue. You're all familiar with it. Partial strangulation is one. G-force-induced loss of consciousness, which is when you put pilots in a centrifuge and you spin them around and you drain blood out of their brain. Blood goes to their feet because of this G-force, this acceleration, and they pass out. Cardiac arrest also causes hypoxia because you don't have a heart to send blood to your brain. And in all of these cases, there are very clear documented instances in the literature of an enrichment of experience. For instance, G-lock. There was a study from 1990. It's all linked to the videos and the description of the videos in the Essentia Foundation course. It's all linked in there. You can find all these papers. In this 1990 study, they interviewed the pilots after they came around from G-lock, from syncope, and asked them, did you experience anything during the period in which, for us, you were unconscious? In other words, during the period in which you were unresponsive. And the pilots consistently reported, and I will quote, memorable dreams. So they were not unconscious at all. They were non-responsive, and that's different. From the outside, they looked unconscious, but from the inside, they were having memorable dreams with a richness and intensity of experience that far exceeded the experience of just being spun around in a closed capsule in a centrifuge. So blood is drained out of their brain, and they have memorable dreams instead of everything going dark. Cardiac arrest, there was this paper by Pim van Lommel published in respected medicine journal, I believe in 2001, in the Lancet, in which I think 18% of cardiac arrest patients reported very rich and intense experiences during the period of cardiac arrest. And Dr. van Lommel was in a good position to know that because he's a cardiologist, so he was there trying to resuscitate these people. So in a time when there is no circulation, no oxygenation of the brain, and therefore brain function ceases in seconds, people reported amazing experiences that changed their lives, changed their behavior for the rest of their lives. Partial strangulation, you'd think that if you go into syncope because you're strangling yourself, that you would experience nothing. Well, surely you become unresponsive, but there is a game called the choking game. It's a dangerous game played by teenagers worldwide. And the marketing pitch amongst teenagers for this game is you can have a psychedelic trip without the drug. All you need to do is to strangle yourself. And when you go into that syncope, teenagers report amazing experiences. And if you'd read those reports, you almost feel like you want to do it yourself because it's amazing stuff. The problem is that it has to be partial strangulation. So somebody has to be around to untie whatever you're doing to your neck. Otherwise, you do die. You know, that trip becomes a forever trip. And some teenagers do die because they're doing this alone. And they think that they will retain enough control to be half in the trance and half awake in order to sort of get out of that before it's too late. But some of them fail in doing that. So this is not recommended at all. Psychedelics are a lot safer than this choking game. But this is reported in the medical literature worldwide. We know this happens. And teenagers, as crazy as they might be, they don't do something like this if there is no payoff, if the experience is a lie. And you can go on and on. The transcranial magnetic stimulation. There was research done several years ago in Geneva. Somebody who had epilepsy. And if you would disrupt brain function through transcranial magnetic stimulation, if you disrupt brain function in a certain area of the brain, you could induce on demand out-of-body experiences. You have acquired savant, which is very, very well documented in the literature for many years already. People who suffer lightning strikes to the head, trauma to the head after major accidents, bullet wounds to the head, the progression of dementia, all these things are known to often be correlated with increased cognitive skills somehow. People become artists. They learn how to play the piano like a virtuoso, or they have prodigious memory. Suddenly they can remember every single detail of every single day of their lives, decades afterwards. This is documented. I'm not talking about anecdotal evidence here. So yeah, again, massive compromise to ordinary brain function and an enrichment of conscious inner life. Generalized physiological stress. I mean, initiatory rituals worldwide are known to induce physiological stress. Fasting, sweat lodges in which you sort of sweat for 3 days and 3 nights in a row, extreme physical exertion. All these things are used in initiatory rituals worldwide. And why do these peoples, these pre-literate peoples worldwide, why do they do this? If you ask them, they will say through this initiation, our teenagers will become acquainted with the greatest secrets of reality. Yeah, that's what they say. And how do they achieve that insight, that revelation? Through physiological stress, which is bound to compromise ordinary brain function. So there you go. Although ordinarily experience is undeniably correlated with patterns of cortical activation, there is a very broad pattern of non-ordinary circumstances in which an impairment or a reduction of brain activity correlates precisely with the most insightful, the most rich, intense experiences a human being can have. How do you make sense of that according to physicalism? There is no plausible option on the table. For psychedelics alone, there is a tentative option, and that's the entropic brain or minute increases of brain noise. But even if that held any water, which it doesn't, I think that hypothesis is embarrassing. But even if it weren't, there is a lot more on the table that would go without an explanation under physicalist premises. So I will wrap it up here. Ramesh, I'm done.
Yeah. Thank you, Bernardo, for it was encapsulated with this evidences from brain imaging data in your case. Of course, a lot many things can be said, but I think you were probably trying to argue using this data, suggesting that the usual interpretations do not work. Like we can't have a naturalistic account of this phenomena. But I was wondering whether in saying so, or in, of course, you had some methodological criticism. You seem to suggest that mental phenomena or experiential states arise because of certain physiological phenomena. So in that sense, you accept both exist independently of one another.
No,
Or you are offering a causal account with some reservation. What is?
Yeah, I didn't discuss at all how I personally make sense of this, because otherwise I would speak for another.
I get that because of course, I was expecting a long winding metaphysical explanation, but for the audience who are here, would you offer one coherent, your own point of view? Because we have our own ways of criticizing this data. Considering what we know or our metaphysical philosophical stance. What's your take on because brain imaging today has caught up the fancy of everyone. Like it is considered some sort of a window to whether you accept mental states or not. But that's the scientific fact that there is something happening and we can track it, and then you can correlate. And so, how all this fits into anything?
Yeah, I'll try to summarize it. Of course, there will be lots of holes because it's impossible to give all the details in a short time. But let me start by prefacing it and saying that I am a reductionist and I am a naturalist. And I would be very fond of finding a mechanistic explanation for this. And I think there is one, but it's not a physicalist one. What do we mean by a mechanistic explanation? We mean a natural explanation, a coherent chain of causes and effects that can be appreciated through some measurements, as opposed to Deus ex machina, a God that wants to fool around with us and create stuff arbitrarily. And that's not the position I defend. So you could even say that, understood this way, I am a mechanicist as well. I'm just not a physicalist. So I am a reductionist. I am a naturalist. I'm even a mechanicist, but I'm not a physicalist. So how do I make sense of this? To follow how I see this, we have to take a couple of steps back from physicalism and monitor very explicitly our cognitive activity to make sure that we are not making unexamined physicalist assumptions that are coloring our thinking. So the main physicalist idea is that there is this thing outside mind as a category. In other words, there is a thing that is not mental. And activities or the structure, the function of certain arrangements of that thing that is not mental somehow cause or generate mentality. That's the premise of physicalism. I deny that thing. I think all there is mentality. All there is conscious experience. Not necessarily metacognitive conscious experience, not necessarily conscious experience that you can introspect into and report to yourself, but experience nonetheless in the phenomenal sense, in the sense of being qualia, of being qualities. I think that's all there is. But it's not your experiences alone. It's not my mind alone. It's not even the sum total of experiences of all individual minds. There is an external world, which is not in your mind, not in my mind, not in the mind of any living being, but that external world is itself mental in essence. Its category is mentality. It's not my thoughts. It's not your thoughts. It's transpersonal thoughts. I even hesitate using the word thoughts because it's too anthropomorphic. It's transpersonal mental activity underlying the rest of nature. And what are our personal minds then? My view is that we are dissociated complexes of this spatially unbound field of subjectivity that constitutes the essence of all nature. When segments of this field become dissociated, individual minds are created. And we know from the psychiatric literature that dissociation is for real, especially since the turn of the century with brain imaging. We know that dissociation is not only something that is clinically reported, but something that can be diagnosed under a brain scan. People are not lying about it. So we know how that, we know that it's literally blinding. It can make you blind, even though there's nothing wrong with your eyesight. You become completely blind in a dissociative state. So we know that. So what I do is I extend that to a transpersonal field of subjectivity, which itself can also become naturally dissociated. Now, what do these dissociated complexes look like within this transpersonal field of subjectivity? Metabolizing living beings. So in my view, life is what dissociation in a transpersonal mind looks like when it's observed. Just like dissociative processes in a patient of a dissociative identity disorder, those processes can be seen under an fMRI. There's this study by Yolanda Schlum from 2014 showing precisely that. But in our case, we are within the mental system, that we don't need to see through a skull. We are within the universal mental system. So we don't need an fMRI to see dissociation look around. If I see my cat, there is a dissociative process. Now, if that is the case, there are two types of mental activity in every living being. The first type is the dissociative process itself, which is what we call life. It looks like life, looks like metabolism. And the other type are the contents of the dissociation, the endogenous mental activity that arise within the boundaries of the dissociation. If you impair the latter, you have cognitive deficit. If you impair my thoughts, my emotions, I will be cognitively impaired, right? So that's the correlation we are used to seeing: less brain activity, less cognition, less inner experience. But what if you impair the dissociative process itself? Then you weaken the dissociative boundary and you allow for cognitive associations across the boundary. And that can only be reported as enriched experience, as increased levels of self-transcendence, as psychedelic trips beyond the body. That's what I think is happening.
So, I mean, if I can capture this, you were saying that individual reality produced by either external hallucinatory agents or meditation or many other things, they create a reality that is transcendental in the sense that it is beyond the individual and it's a snapshot as long as it lasts. And then the rest of the reality is the usual reality without the excitation of an unusual nature, and that we go by with. So you are claiming there is an ongoing consciousness or reality which is fundamentally a constituent of the universe, of which we connect with it only in exceptional situations. And various cultures have created their own styles of inducing, either through drugs or practices, or even religions have played a role. So then the individual reality of which we are worried as scientists in this correlation is not basically the end of it. So
yes, I think we are inserted in the notion of mentation, which presents itself to us under ordinary circumstances as perception. So perception is something that evolution has created in us, changes in our dissociative boundary that allows us to acquire information about what's going on beyond the dissociative boundary through impingement on the dissociative boundary. Now, what does the dissociative boundary look like? Well, our skin, our retinas, our eardrums, the mucous lining of our nose, the surface of our tongue. This is what this dissociative boundary looks like when perceived. And of course, the external world impinges on the dissociative boundary and conveys information through that process of impingement. Evolution has learned to change us in such a way as to leverage that information that we can acquire through impingement. So we don't cross the dissociative boundary. It's just that the external world impinges on the dissociative boundary, conveying information to us. And the dynamics here is that of a Markov blanket. I don't know whether you guys are used to this terminology, but our dissociative boundary is a Markov blanket. And through this impingement, information can be passed across the blanket. Now, the result of this is perception. It's the stuff you see, hear, taste, smell. But perception, in my view, is like a dashboard of instruments on an airplane. It's not a transparent window into the world out there as it actually is. It's a translation of measurements of that world into a set of internal instruments. And what we call physicality is just those instruments. It's like you're a pilot flying by instrument alone because there is a storm outside, so the windshield is useless. You can't see anything, so you rely on your instruments. Now, your instruments convey true and relevant information about the world, so much so that you can fly a plane safely and land by instruments alone. But the instrument panel doesn't look anything like the world as it is in itself. It looks totally different. The information is true, accurate, and important, but it's not presented in a way that qualitatively resembles the world as it is in itself. So my argument is physicality is the instrument panel. It conveys important, accurate information about the world to allow us to navigate the world safely and survive. But it doesn't look anything like the world as it is in itself. The world as it is in itself is mental. During a psychedelic trip, I think what's happening is that the dissociative boundary is weakened. It becomes more porous, more permeable, and we then get a glimpse into the world as it actually is in itself. It's a small, semi-transparent window into the world as it is behind the instrument panel, behind the screen of perception. And that, of course, goes highly mixed up with our own repressed stuff. So psychedelic gnosis is very unreliable. I think people who entertain the idea that whatever they experience during a psychedelic trance is the true reality out there, I think they're just fooling themselves because it's a very noisy channel. I think there are things that they experience that are the true reality, but it's all mixed in with their own repressed stuff to which they become exposed, again, because the boundaries of dissociation are weakened.
One last clarification. You said the world out there is mental, and we create some sort of snapshots, a manageable snapshot because of the way we have been evolutionarily designed. An evolutionary survival account could be offered of the dashboard explanation because that's how we create a manageable reality and then we circulate that reality around and create agreeability. And that's how things look the way they look, and we enjoy a sunset and I like, but then there is a world out there. You were saying it is mental. Would you clarify in what sense it is mental? Because it looks like a bit of panpsychism, but I'm not quite sure whether it has mentality inherently in it or it is mental in what sense?
Yeah, what I'm putting forward is completely different than constitutive panpsychism. Okay. The constitutive panpsychism idea is that matter really exists. It's not something mental purely. It does have other physical properties that are not mental, such as mass, charge, spin, momentum. But in addition to those fundamental, irreducible physical properties, it also has mental properties. That's constitutive panpsychism. The universe is conscious. What I'm putting forward is idealism, and it's a different statement. It says the universe is in consciousness. And what I'm saying is that there is nothing that is not mental. What we call mass, charge, momentum, spin are properties of the dials on our dashboard. These are concepts that arise out of an effort to describe and model the behavior of the dials on our dashboard of instruments, the screen of perception. What is behind what is being measured in order to be displayed on the instrument panel is mental. Now, what do I mean by mental? Mental is the only thing we have all ever been directly acquainted with. Everything that is not mental is an abstraction of mentality. We say matter is not mental, but all we know about matter is mental because a color is mental, taste is mental, texture is mental, concepts are mental. So all we have ever is mentality, but we create this conceptual abstraction within mentality that there is something out there that is not mental. And that's all we know about it, this abstraction, because we can never escape mentality. We are cooped up in mental stuff, qualitative stuff, qualia. So my only step is to acknowledge the obvious. Mentality is all that exists. The only legitimate motivation for us to conceptualize something non-mental is if that is the only way to make sense of empirical experience. For instance, to make sense of the fact that we all seem to share the same world, because if you were sitting next to me, you would describe my office in a way consistent with me. So there seems to be something outside our individual mentation. But then we take a step too far. I acknowledge there is something outside our individual mentation, but physicalists then go and say, and that is also not mental. Now, you don't need that step to make sense of things. All you need to do is say, yes, there is something outside our individual mentations. We all inhabit a world, but that world, for all we know, is also mental. And we can explain everything on that basis. We don't need to postulate something non-mental.
So just to sum it up, I think as Searle created this dichotomy of ontological and epistemological facts, that there are ontological facts, according to him, probably they are part of nature, like Mount Everest will be there if all of us go now from here. And it doesn't know it is called Mount Everest. And epistemologic is what we create, our brains create. So that being the old way of talking about it, which of course gives rise to the classical dualism. What you are saying connects more to Galen Strawson's way of talking. If you stretch current particle physics to its extreme and epistemologically analyze, it becomes this, that we are giving meaning to what they are, and there is nothing inherently so-called material in that sense. And therefore, it is probably our addiction or this temptation to uphold the religion of science that as a byproduct, we have maintained this dichotomy. I think it makes some sense. Ultimately, it is one reality, and we merely seem to have a glimpse of it now and then, depending on our systems. So it is, of course, open. Now, I think, yeah, you may react to it, and then it opens up to you.
I understand the thrust of what you're saying, and I agree with it. I'm so used after so many years of being criticized on small details that I have this. I always want to go down to the nitty-gritty to really clarify what I mean. So I'll do it now. Forgive me if I'm being too precious here. Galen, at least last time I spoke to him, he was a constitutive panpsychist. So he thought of matter as something that exists in and of itself. It is not essentially mental, but it has mental properties, or it has a mental essence, but beyond that essence, the structure of mentality is the structure of matter. In other words, individual elementary subatomic particles have a little consciousness of their own, and they somehow combine to form the unitary conscious inner life we have. I disagree with that. I think that faces a number of problems. I think that is physically incoherent because it assumes fundamental subatomic particles to have discrete spatial boundaries. And from quantum field theory, we know that that's not the case. Elementary subatomic particles are just patterns of localized patterns of excitation in quantum fields, which are spatially unbound. So it fails there, and it also fails on the combination problem, which is there is no coherent way to argue that two fundamentally separate fields of subjectivity can combine to form a seemingly unitary one. That's the combination problem. Idealism faces the decomposition problem. So instead of going from several minds into more complex minds, you come from one universal mind down to seemingly separate minds. But the decomposition problem is solved empirically through the notion of dissociation. So that was one observation. Another quick observation, that the epistemic knowledge and ontic aspects of reality. I agree that we cannot defend idealism merely by saying, all I know is mentation, therefore mentation is all that exists, because now we are making a fallacious bridge between epistemology and ontology. We are saying, because I don't know anything more than mental, then the whole world is mental. And that's a fallacious step. It's a step that can only be used in the framework of parsimony considerations, meaning, do I need to postulate anything beyond mentality in order to account for all empirical behavior? If I don't need to do that, then on parsimony grounds, on Occam's razors motivation, I will say, then I will not make that postulate of something non-mental. But that's different than the epistemic ontic fallacy, which is, since I have never been to China, well, I have, let me choose another country. Since I have never been to New Zealand, then New Zealand doesn't exist. It's a figment of my imagination. No, this is fallacious, because we need to postulate the existence of New Zealand in order to account for images we've seen, the reports of others. It's the most simple explanation that New Zealand does exist. So I like to think that I don't make this error in my argument, because I'm appealing to parsimony and I'm not mixing up epistemology and ontology. Moreover, I leverage a lot of empirical evidence, as we discussed with you today, from neuroscience of consciousness and neuroimaging. There is much stronger yet evidence from foundations of physics, which has been replicated for the past 40 odd years. So I don't base my case on this naivete of thinking, if I don't know, then it doesn't exist.
Thank you, Bernardo, for the clarification. If the audience has any few questions, we would like to take them. So please go ahead and be topical of the point.
Okay. Hi. I have a question. So going by the dashboard metaphor that you talked about of the dials. So if we are saying that the dashboard works accurately, so even if I can't see the storm outside or the clouds and the lightning, I can still navigate accurately based on the dashboard alone. If you're saying that, then can't we also make the argument that it doesn't matter what the world is really like, as long as this interface that we have, it works. You know, it works to have a model of it. It works to like do whatever we need to do. So why does it matter if we can't see what is actually outside, if this works just as well?
Because of the implications. As long as it works just as well, I think you have a point. There is no reason to go beyond. But there are instances in which it doesn't work just as well. It works fully well if we are non-metacognitive animals who are not walking around contemplating the meaning of existence and what happens after death, and the ontic value of sympathy and empathy and kind-heartedness. So if you are my cat, then it doesn't matter. If you are the mosquito at night, it doesn't matter. But when it comes to us, it does matter, because we are metacognitive beings and we are pondering the meaning of it all. When we are pondering what's going to happen after death. And those ponderings, those thoughts are grounded in certain metaphysical assumptions about what the world is in and of itself. And they lead to conclusions that can enrich or destroy your life. If you think that your very subjectivity is going to end when you die, death will become a major source of anxiety in your life. If you think that the world that is really out there is non-mental, and therefore whatever insights you have will ultimately be pointless because your whole mental inner life is going to dissolve into nothingness, then life has no meaning, has no point, and the whole exercise in living becomes a journey through the depths of depression and darkness. So I agree with the premise of your question. If it doesn't matter, then we shouldn't care. The problem is that for us, it does matter. It matters mightily. It matters enormously, because we are not just trying to hunt, eat, and survive the predators and take shelter at night. We are philosophical beings capable of metacognition.
I think I would just add one sentence to that. I think we as a species are pretty much designed and addicted to explore a kind of phenomenality that goes this everyday sense of reality, because that's our ultimate desire and expectation. That's why collective unhappiness and various diseases and disagreeability and all kinds of things that we see, because we are not satisfied with this interface that comes naturally. We expect all the time much more. In linguistic research, the meanings that people comprehend goes way beyond the syntax, and metaphysical speculations that begin in usual normal relationships. People immediately are frustrated with what they have taught, and so I think this could be the way we are designed, and there's no harm in accepting it as a scientific question for us to really ponder on. So that's what probably he's trying to indicate. But for the world to go on, for people to keep on living in the everyday sense of the world, the usual dashboard interface and perception of reality and its transaction with other fellow members of the species does work. But then we have this ocean of unhappiness that has no clear answer with the current approaches. I think, therefore, we are speculative and metaphysical by nature.
And it's self-generated depression and anxiety, Ramesh, I think, because it arises out of a metaphysical interpretation of what's going on. Previous generations, and I'm talking now far distant past, they didn't have this. I will be mentioning Western philosophers now because this is a tricky ground for me to start mentioning Eastern philosophies, because you will quickly correct me and realize the depths of my naivete and ignorance. So I'll stick with Western philosophers. Owen Barfield wrote a whole book called Saving the Appearances. And there he makes clear that before this materialist metaphysics became the mainstream narrative, it became really mainstream late in the 19th century in the West, but its roots can be found when the beginning of science tried to carve out a space for itself in view of the church. So it came up with a materialist dogma that was meant to combat another dogma, to give them a sort of safe space for them to do their research. So it's 400 years old. Before that, we all understood that the world we saw around us on the dashboard were appearances, and that behind the appearances, there was something of a nature equal to our own, mental. And for them, the world was symbolic because appearances point to something else that underlies them, something behind them, something profoundly meaningful and transcendent. So for these older generations, the dashboard was not only operationally useful as it still is, it was a symbolic book to be read and interpreted, which imparted tremendous depth of meaning and significance to life, every life. And that depth of dimension is what we have given up, amputated, cut away, because of the metaphysical assumption of materialism, because now we think the appearances are not appearances, they are the thing in itself. There is nothing behind matter that matter is pointing to, indicating, or betraying, or disclosing in some way. There's nothing there. Matter is what it is. The appearance is the end of the story. And that amputation is a creation of ourselves. We did this. There is nothing in the intuitive roots of our being and our biology that required this at all. We did this out of a cultural narrative that took root and became a generalized worldwide psychosis.
Yeah, it's the French mathematician, philosopher Blaise Pascal actually was of the opinion that we are all designed to accept God by constantly negating him, and that's our life. And that's rationalism or empiricism. He was okay with that. He was a mathematician. His disagreement with Descartes was in and around this kind of an issue, that we are metaphysically inclined to accept the unknown, but our journey will be through this turbulence of cross-questioning and being in trouble and whatever we end up calling the scientific method or naturalism or etc. So I think we were somewhere we are in that space in the Pascalian doubt or acceptance. I think we will like to, maybe if there are other points on Bernardo's, anybody, please go ahead.
Hi, I have a question. Thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. And I have been wondering again about your dashboard metaphor, just to try to frame my question correctly. So if we are trying to, if we say that everything is mental and there is some matter around us which represents again some mental phenomenon, then how do we discriminate matter which is outside the physical bodies that we embody, qualitatively different in terms of mentality? Like, is there a theoretical explanation for that? This is part A of the question. And I want to further understand how can a psychedelic drug, which is something external, again, material, getting access to something internal, mental, more directly than, let's say, brain by its own virtue of existing in our bodies.
Yeah. It's very difficult for us to escape dualist thinking. And that's exactly what's happening in your question. You're thinking dualist terms. There is some kind of matter that has an effect, a mental effect in the mind within. Under idealism, matter, all matter, is what mentation looks like when observed from across a dissociative boundary. And it can be more than one boundary. When I look at you, what I'm seeing is how your inner conscious life presents itself to me across two dissociative boundaries, your own and mine. So matter, all matter, is what mentation looks like when measured from across a dissociative boundary under all cases. Now you might ask, okay, what about a psychedelic? Or let's make it simpler. What about when I drink a glass of wine? Something happens in my conscious inner life when I put that material that I can see and touch and smell and taste, I put that in, something happens in my mental inner life that is qualitatively completely different from the wine itself. The wine is red, it tastes like wine, it smells a certain way, a certain set of qualities. And what it does to my inner life is a completely different set of qualities. I feel airy, relaxed, make more associations with less filtering. So what's going on there? Or let's take even a more drastic example. I'm undergoing neurosurgery. And there comes a neurosurgeon with a scalpel, a metal scalpel. And as you know, neurosurgery is done while you are awake. And he starts poking around my brain and all kinds of things happen. He uses an electromagnetic probe, he starts poking around and, hey, suddenly I can't speak anymore. or suddenly all kinds of feelings are induced. It seems to our dualistic minds that what's happening is obvious. Matter has a causal effect on mind. And we know that the causal direction is from matter to mind because it starts with a scalpel or a shocking probe, and it ends with an experience I feel from inside. So, well, it seems so obvious. Where is this going wrong? I'll tell you where this is going wrong. The scalpel, the probe, the wine, the psychedelic pill, insofar as they are material, they too are basically the appearance of mental processes, transpersonal mental processes. But there is no scalpel in and of itself. There is a mental process out there that presents itself on the dashboard as what we call the scalpel. There is no glass of wine in and of itself. There is a process out there that presents itself on the dashboard of dials once it's measured as what we call a glass of wine. So it's a transpersonal mental process interfering with personal mental processes because they have come across the dissociative boundary. In the case of the scalpel, by cutting. In the case of the electromagnetic probe, by pumping in and field inside your brain, going through the dissociative boundary. In the case of the glass of wine, by drinking. So it's one mental process being brought across the dissociative boundary and modulating another mental process within. That one mental process can qualitatively modulate another is empirically trivial. Your thoughts modulate your emotions and the other way around every day. Your imagination modulates your emotions. Just picture a dead person and think, I'm going to die one day, and you see what happens to your mental life. So my point is, the scalpel and the wine are doing exactly the same thing that you do when you have a negative thought and observe what happens to your emotions. It's just that in one case, the interfering process is endogenous. You create it within your dissociative boundary. And in the other case, it's brought from the outside. It interferes across the dissociative boundary because you're cutting through it or drinking it or swallowing it, whatever. But you see, it's just a different way to regard this relationship between matter and mind. Maybe I'm wrong in what I'm saying, but for you to be able to judge correctly the validity or lack thereof of what I'm saying, you have to understand what I'm saying according to the premises of what I'm saying. If you inject dualism into it, you're creating a straw man. And unfortunately, that's what happens all the time.
There is a question in the chat box by Amrut Avalli. Would you go ahead and you can ask this question differently, or Bernardo answer this about neuroscience?
Is it the last one?
Yeah, the last one.
So I'll read it out loud because I have to read it anyway for myself. Given the evidence linking reduction in brain activity to rich subjective experience, what is the place of neuroscience as an empirical method of investigation? Specifically, how do we proceed now with neuroimaging research? Oh, I think if anything, what I'm putting forward highlights the tremendous importance of neuroscience and neuroimaging. Because now, I'll try to convey this in a more poetic sense, because I think it's important that you guys see the poetry of what you do. When you're looking at a brain or a brain scan, it's not just a 1.5 kilo, 2 kilo object made of gray and white matter that has some patterns of neuron firings. That's not the whole story. What you're seeing there is a window into the whole universe of another person's inner life. That person's whole life, all emotions, all history, all insights, all successes and disappointments, all failures, all learnings, all perspectives, all dreams, all dispositions, character traits, hopes, dreams. What you're seeing is how that entire universe of conscious inner life, that thing that you cannot contain within spatial or temporal boundaries, that thing that is as big as the universe because it's not spatial temporal in nature, it is presenting itself to you as that object. And it's allowing itself to be manipulated by you through that object of perception. So that image that you study is a window into an endless infinity that is compressing itself and presenting itself to you as the object of your study. Man, I get goosebumps just to think of it. And all the correlations between experience and patterns of brain activation or inhibition, neurotransmitters and their effects, receptors, all of that is the encoded language of an inner life that has no boundaries. By studying that, you are studying through proxy something that is beyond your wildest imagination, because you will never be directly acquainted with the inner life of another person. The best you can have is that object, that image that presents itself on the screen of your perception, on the dashboard of your dials. Go about it with deep reverence and respect, with a sense of the profound significance that what you're doing has. And none of the correlations that we found empirically become invalid because of what we are saying. You see, the image of a phenomenon correlates with the phenomenon. Even if the image is mental and the phenomenon is mental, the correlations are still valid. You see, I take a tricyclic antidepressant because of my tinnitus, and I owe my life to that thing. Do I disregard neuroscience? Far from it. I owe my life to neuroscience. If people hadn't understood neurotransmitters and receptors and the molecular dynamics of that whole thing, my life would be hell right now. So none of it is invalid. If anything, the only change is the depth of meaning and significance that it acquires based on this perspective. Please go ahead, study it, make better psychoactive drugs, give us a treatment for depression. Do what you're doing, because God knows it's desperately needed. But let us also not neglect meditation and spirituality, because that's the other avenue going to the same place. One directly and the other one through a dissociative boundary. Both are valid and important.
All right, so I think if there are no other questions, we what about the other candles? I think this is a very general question that she's asking. Can you be more focused? Because the discussion is on neuroscientific findings, evidences, where it is progressing.
I understand what you're saying about neuroscience and imaging techniques. So what about other behavioral techniques? Like, can we also use like non-invasive or non-brain imaging techniques to understand consciousness or cognition?
Can you give me 30 seconds to take a bio break? Because I'm holding myself after I drank a liter of water. I'll be right back. 30 seconds, okay? I'll be right back.
I think we can request the audience, if they have questions later, when they watch the video, they can put this on the YouTube channel, and then the speakers can enter into some discussions. It's not necessary that they clarify everything now. There is always a constraint.
Okay, I'm back. All right, your question. I think the answer is yes. You see, social species, cooperative species like we are, evolution has made sure that we involuntarily betray our inner mental state through the configuration of our body. When we cry, the physical contortion of our facial muscles and the tears flowing down our faces, those are symbols. They are pointing to my inner life, my inner sadness, which is the thing in itself. Now, that thing in itself produces an image on the screen of perception, on the dashboard, which we call tears and contorted facial muscles. So we are wired up to sort of betray our own inner lives, betray in the sense of revealing in an unintentional way, to betray our inner lives to the group, because that facilitates collaboration. There are species in which this is even more dramatic. Cuttlefish. Cuttlefish have this color cells on their skin, and you can see their thoughts because of the changing patterns of color and light. So neuroimaging is just a way to sort of peel the onion of physical representations one layer deeper, because sometimes not only do we not produce a physical correlate of certain inner states, although it's rare, and even when you are depressed, you produce all kinds of physical correlates. For instance, your behavior. You don't want to jump out of bed in the morning. You're betraying your inner life all the time, all the way along. But there are some inner states that are trickier to find, that people cannot introspect into, that don't fall within the field of metacognition or re-representation. These are experiences they have, but they don't know that they are having. They can't report that to others or even to themselves. And that's where neuroimaging comes in, because you peel one layer of the onion and you can look deeper inside to patterns of brain activity that review aspects of one's inner life that are not available even to one's own introspection, one's own ability to introspect. Not to mention the diagnostic value of neuroimaging, because that's a very complex pattern that we see there, and the patterns of brain activation are very complex, and they are amenable to more accurate diagnostic differentiation than just observing one's behavior. That's the value, but it adds something. It doesn't invalidate diagnosis through behavior, which is how every doctor in the world went about diagnosing patients until the end of the 19th century. What I would outright reject in association with the word behavior is none of what I said, but the charade, in my view, of what has been now called behaviorism. That, I think, is a charade, because what that says is behavior is not only an image, a representation of an inner mental state. No, behavior is all there is. Now, that's a complete failure of logic and empiricism, or it's a complete failure of introspection, of reason. So that I reject. To say that there is only behavior and nothing behind it, I think it's as silly as to say there's only behavior but nothing that behaves. There is a mental inner life that behavior is an image of, a representation of. It's what mental inner life looks like on the screen of perception. But that image is underlain by something that has standalone existence.
Okay, so is that all? I think if there are no other points or questions, we should end it here, because he first suggested he would speak for 35 minutes, but we have dragged on to 100 hours. I think it was a very wholesome, stimulating session, I would say, and the tentacles of these ideas are too many for us to capture here. And each of you are free to have your own take on it, and please follow his videos and other lectures on the internet and get in touch with him. If you have other questions, many of you are students, I know, and that's why it is even more important. Before you commit yourself several years of your life to some ideology of belief, it is better to be self-critical and examine. I am not saying whatever he said or his point of view has absolute validity. There is no such thing in this field, at least. So it is one point of view, which I think has deep connections to other emerging points of views. And it encourages us. Basically, it satisfies our incorrigibility towards metaphysicality. We are incorrigible. We are never satisfied with the empirical facts, and we still want to know quite a bit that we. That's why. So I think it encourages us. It sort of authenticates that desire, that kind of philosophy of mind. And so with this, I thank Bernardo Kastrup for his time. And I'm quite sure that many of you who have been with us, and particularly here today, and this would influence your thinking, and you will challenge certain concepts that you might have accepted so far. And I'm quite sure that we will have many other conferences as soon as things become normal next year. And you are more than welcome to become our guest here at Hyderabad. And your desire to visit places like Banaras or other places, India is very, very vast. And the authenticate land of spirituality and the long traditional practices that are still visible everywhere, in all religions, not just in Hinduism, but all religions that are part of the subcontinent. So it would be our pleasure to welcome you, and I think it is a possibility. And so thank you all the audience, and please spread the word. We will have another speaker after some time. We try to do it once in a month at least. Your ideas and suggestions are also welcome. If you have any name or any idea or what should be. So it has been a wonderful evening here in India, and I think it is afternoon in Netherlands. So it's your coffee time, and it's our dinner time or a little bit. So
thanks for having me, Ramesh and Seema. It's been a pleasure and an honor.
It was completely our pleasure or my pleasure, I would say, because many of the thoughts I interjected, I have been thinking, not writing professionally in philosophy journals because I have not attempted that, but I do disperse these ideas in small groups and try to even understand the empirical facts from these points of view. So I too am incorrigibly, unsatisfied. There's no such thing like, okay, we know quite a bit about the brain and let's go home, or we know about the neurons. It was all about that basically, that we are designed to be incorrigible, and there may be something waiting for us. But the key idea that you kept on hammering, that there is out there something and which is mental in a logical, analytical sense. That's why you are not abandoning the traditional methods of explanation. They are helpful, but the proposition is this. So it avoids this unrealistic dualism and arrogance and feelings of self-satisfiedness in narrow circles, which at least the future generation of researchers must not abide by, because this field requires that kind of an attitude. This is my point of view. You may disagree. So a lot of words here. Thank you. Thanks everyone. We will see everyone next. And thanks Bernardo again.
Thank you guys. Take care.
Yeah.